Now, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to give a special shout out to our sponsor, 4Air. 4Air is leading the way with the industry's first framework to address aviation's climate impact, offering clear, verifiable pathways to reduce and counteract aircraft emissions. Their new Assure SAF registry is making it easier than ever to manage and claim sustainable aviation fuel usage across the value chain. Want to learn more? Check out the show notes.
So we need to really see a vision for aviation advanced by civil society that covers green fuels, that covers clean planes, that covers contrail mitigation, that has those hard discussions about curbing excessive flying, and that considers the role for carbon removals as well. And of course, this is going to need, a whole suite of policy, regulatory, and voluntary action.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simply Flying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Anna Stratton, the Associate Director for Aviation at ClimateWorks Foundation. ClimateWorks is a global platform for philanthropy that has granted over $1.8 billion to more than 850 organizations across 50 countries. Unique as a re-guarantor, ClimateWorks partners with philanthropic organizations to fund high-impact climate solutions. It's one of the few foundations, really, with a dedicated aviation strategy. It focuses on areas like SAF, zero-emission aircraft, and even contrail mitigation. So in this episode, Anna and I talk about insights into scaling sustainable aviation technologies and the pivotal role philanthropy can play in driving aviation's transition to net zero. I hope you enjoy it. Anna, it's great to be finally speaking. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Can you tell us a bit about ClimateWorks and what you do at ClimateWorks?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very excited to be here. I'm a longtime listener, first-time caller. So I feel honored to be on. Let me start a little bit with ClimateWorks Foundation generally. So we were built to really help philanthropy innovate and scale high-impact climate solutions that benefit both people and the planet. And we offer 3 essential services that support this goal. So the first is insights and data on the opportunities and gaps that philanthropy can fill, and that is led by our global intelligence team. The second is convening funders together with our implementing partners to strategize on solutions, which is led by our funder collaborations team. And then the third is our strategic sectoral or regional programs, where we co-create strategies and grant make to help achieve strategic goals. And since 2008, ClimateWorks has actually granted over $1.8 billion to more than 850 grantees in over 50 countries. So we have a pretty wide reach.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite impressive. So am I right to say you are someone like a Breakthrough Energy? Are you like a VC or do you just give grants?
No, so we're not like Breakthrough Energy. We're what is called a re-grantor. So we take money, we receive money from other philanthropic organizations. And then in collaboration with those organizations, as well as our partners, we come up with strategies specific to sectors or regions. And then we provide grants to other organizations that are aligned with those strategies to achieve those goals.
I'm very curious. Who are your funders? 1.8 billion seems like a lot.
So our funders range. You're welcome to look at our website where we post all of this information very transparently on both our funders as well as the recipients of our grants. But there would be familiar names, of course, from big players in the philanthropy space.
What is the mandate here for ClimateWorks Foundation? How do you find who to give this grant to? Is it by sector, by industry, by technology type, by short-term versus long-term impact? How do you split it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So primarily our grant making is split either by sector or by regional focus. And then we set strategies for those sectors or regions with key outcomes that have been defined, and then work with local partners, leading experts that can help support the achievement of those overarching goals. And so when it comes to aviation, ClimateWorks is actually one of the few foundations to have a dedicated strategy for aviation, as well as a dedicated grant-making portfolio. And I have the pleasure and privilege of getting to lead that program.
Wow. As the leader of the aviation practice at ClimateWorks Foundation, what are your goals? What do you do on a day-to-day basis?
Well, that can range wildly, but I would say at a very high level, my job really requires that I work in close partnership with other philanthropic organizations that have an interest in decarbonizing aviation, as well as with our grantees to implement a strategy on aviation decarbonization. And our focus areas include support for truly sustainable alternative fuels, for zero emission plane scale, for contrail mitigation, and then, of course, working to reduce demand for aviation where alternatives exist. And then also, I work in very close partnership with our carbon dioxide removal team to work on the effective deployment of carbon removals in the aviation sector for those residual emissions that may not otherwise be addressed through behavioral change or technology scale. And I would say, really foundational to the work that we do across ClimateWorks and then specifically on aviation is a really strong basis of research and analysis that then informs policy and regulatory design and implementation. Mm-hmm.
It's very interesting. You just mentioned behavioral change, and I want to just dig that in a bit.
You might pick up on that one.
Yeah, you said behavioral change. But the thing is, the biggest challenge I feel is about growth being reconciled with sustainability in aviation. Mm-hmm. I think it was in August 2022, where you highlighted the potential for reducing business travel demand to cut aviation emissions. But I'm not sure if it's going in that direction. Do you think flying less can be a new norm?
I think we've known for a long time now that, the combination of technology, deployment, timescales, and the climate crisis means that if we're going to put the sector on a credible pathway to aviation decarbonization, we have to reimagine growth, and we have to acknowledge that business as usual growth trajectories are incompatible with the achievement of our climate goals. However, I also think we need to be realistic that it's a very small subset of the global population that is responsible for a majority of aviation emissions. So by specifically working with high-flying groups, and you reference a blog where we talk about our work with corporate travelers, I think we can much more impactfully and strategically rethink demand and have a return that is greater than if we're just generally trying to get publics to reduce their air travel. And I do think we've seen post-COVID, corporate travel has been slower to bounce back than leisure travel. And I also want to highlight, part of the reason for that, it's not just businesses trying to reconcile their scope 3 targets or other emissions goals. It's because of the huge co-benefits that I think corporate travelers felt when they weren't on the road as much. And also, financial savings for companies, health benefits for employees, the well-being of families. So I think we also need to think beyond climate when we're thinking about demand.
So let's build a scenario. What is your pitch to a corporate travel manager or to a company with very large business travel needs? What do you say to them?
Well, this is where we've been really excited to support work called the Travel Smart campaign, which is, you're nodding, so I think you might have heard of them. But it's a collaborative effort of a number of environmental organizations, primarily in Europe. And one thing it does is it highlights sort of the leaders and laggards on corporate travel policy. But even more critically, it provides some of the thought leadership in terms of how companies can start to reimagine their policies. And I think what's exciting about it is it's not saying, stop traveling. It's really saying, can you set out a policy that's more methodical so that a trip by plane becomes the last resort rather than the default for your employees? And it walks through how a company would go about doing that. So again, it's about laying out the alternatives, and that test is really a critical piece of this.
Are companies responsive to such a proposition? What kind of response do you typically get?
So I don't directly lead that work. We support the work. But so you'd have to, go directly to the experts on that. But in conversation with the leaders of the Travel Smart campaign, yes, we have heard some real interest and excitement from companies. And again, as I said, it's the campaign highlights those leaders as well as the laggards. So you can tell from their rankings who is responding and who maybe is less keen on this sort of approach.
In this, who are some of the leaders and what are they doing right?
I prefer not to comment on that one.
Okay, we will encourage everyone to check out the leaders on the Travel Smart page. Let me just get this, make this a bit more real. Airlines like Wizz or Ryanair tout the fact that their per seat mile carbon 2 emissions are decreasing because they use newer planes and they're packing people in. Yet, because they are growing faster, their overall emissions are increasing. And that's on the low cost end. If you look at the business or premium travel end, here's a simple example. Swiss International Airlines is installing a new cabin, Allegris, which is by Lufthansa, the group. And on one of the particular aircraft, on the A330 specifically, which is their oldest wide-body aircraft, inputting the first class cabin forward, it is so heavy that they have to install 1.5 tons of lead plates at the back to just balance out the center of gravity. There are so many technicalities here. Suddenly you've got the most carbon intense first class seats in the world on this aircraft. And yet, I bet there's somebody in Geneva who's authorized to fly first class on transatlantic. How does someone like that justify flying first class?
I mean, maybe they don't. I think part of the work that we do on demand reduction is also public education and awareness. So we want passengers to understand that the choices they make when they travel or choose to fly do have a real impact. And we've also supported work that has by partners that you've had on that have worked to make the emissions of different flights more transparent. So you'll be, of course, well aware that the travel impact model that's used by Google Flights and now a host of other booking websites will let you actually compare the emissions intensity of other flights. So by disclosing those emissions, my hope would be a traveler leaving Geneva would see that exponentially higher business class emissions intensity on Swiss, and they would potentially choose another option.
And I think that's where transparency comes in. That's where platforms like Google come in. Google Flights showcases it for the public. I believe there are other travel platforms like Transport, BCD Travel, which are showcasing carbon emissions in the booking path as well. So transparency there definitely helps. Let's move on from something specific like business travel to something that impacts every flyer. And that is your work with ICAO's CORSIA framework in setting up effective national policies to scale up SAF. Are you able to share some examples of some good policies at a country level that could help with the SAF scale up?
I like that we're getting right into the tough topics here, SAF and demand reduction.
We don't skirt around.
Yes. So I would say at the moment, the policy that we would point to as setting a good standard for national SAF policy would be Europe's ReFuelEU aviation SAF mandate. And there are really three features of this policy that I think make it an effective model. So the first is that it's long term, right? Like it starts now and it goes to 2050. So you have that regulatory certainty that we need for this nascent market. The second is, of course, the specific e-fuels sub-mandate. And that, again, provides that clear signal that while e-fuels may not be commercial now and remain in an early stage, they are going to play a very central role in aviation decarbonization in the future. And then the third is, of course, the robust safeguards that Europe has included that prevent SAF produced using a bio feedstock from competing with food crops and inadvertently leading to deforestation. So those three features we think make ReFuelEU a really interesting model and one that could potentially could be replicated in other jurisdictions.
When it comes to country policies, do you think mandates work better than incentives or the other way around?
It's funny. I often say it's difficult to talk about ReFuelEU without immediately then turning to talk about the US and the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act incentives. I think a lot of the focus right now is, what's better? Is it carrot? Is it stick? For me, that isn't necessarily the key question. So when I compare ReFuelEU with the US SAF incentives, what I see is that the US has missed out on the opportunity to create that long-term certainty, right? Like the credits for SAF end at the end of 27. It doesn't have dedicated support for e-fuels. And then the safeguards for biofuels are either missing or they're very actively under threat by industry. So it's less so, is it a mandate, is it an incentive? It's more, what are the actual details of those policies and what are they incentivizing? And this is why, for me, it's both a very exciting time to be following SAF policy, but very nerve-wracking because I think while there's lots of momentum, if we don't get the details right and in place from the get-go, it's going to be very difficult to set up a market that long-term will be viable and really sustainable.
Do you see the results of the two policies being different? For example, we see the result of IRA being American airlines or US airlines, not American airlines particularly, are well ahead in signing future offtake agreements with SAF suppliers, whereas the European airlines and UK as well are well ahead in the use of SAF today, not necessarily future offtakes. Do you think one is better than the other when it comes to achieving results?
I mean, I don't have a crystal ball to tell you if those future offtake agreements will actually translate to SAF volumes in the future, but certainly the recent reporting and trends would indicate Europe to date has been much more effective at actually getting SAF into the market and into jet engines, whereas the US has been much more hypothetical. And again, I think the US learning, because it's that shorter time scale, it's not going to help a SAF producer that's trying to set up their production plant to only have the credits go to 2027. That doesn't provide the certainty that they need to then be able to go to a bank and say, I need a loan and this can be guaranteed.
Right. Where do you see the role of book and claim coming in when it comes to SAF markets and global equity?
That's the multi-registry, multi-million-dollar question.
Indeed it is.
I think, again, what will be critical is having the strong policy and regulatory frameworks in place to define the types of SAF that are going to be scaled. And then book and claim could be a complement to that. But I do think that this needs to be driven with policy and regulatory action so that we have a consistent understanding of what SAF is, and we have a market that's moving in the same direction, and that we are scaling fuels, again, that can be used into the future and that are not going to cause unintended consequences for food security and for land use.
Fair enough. But what about feedstocks and the different types of feedstocks? I was speaking with someone recently and I learned that, they're thinking about SAF from coconut husk. And I thought, wow, that's a new feedstock I'd not heard of. Mm-hmm. Or, these rather exotic feedstocks that are locally available but may not be recognized globally. How does that work?
Yeah, certainly. So I do think there's room for geographic specificity in terms of the feedstocks that different policies and regulations support. But we do still need to be trying to set consistent standards in terms of, the impacts those are having on land use, on food and feed crops. But yes, I totally understand that, feedstocks that are available in Europe will, of course, differ from what's available in China versus what's available in the US versus what's available in Brazil. But what are the common sustainable principles that we are applying?
I hear you. Yes, I agree. SAF is going to be a big part of the solution, and the supply is currently short. Are you doing something on the grants front to boost this supply of SAF? Has something you done worked?
So we actually are, but I can't speak to you about it until October.
Oh no!
It's very exciting, and I think you'll be keen to hear about it.
Okay,
it's a pretty exciting project. I'll leave that
just for
tantalizing tidbit.
Thank you. Just for the listeners' benefit, when we stop record, we do have these off-the-record conversations in which I get to find out stuff that is not public yet, which is fun. Okay, let's move beyond SAF to hydrogen. It's one of the pathways for decarbonizing, especially short-haul flights. What role do you see hydrogen playing and what can be done to bringing hydrogen aircraft to market?
I think it's a great question. I want to clarify. I think hydrogen, we are excited about its potential both for short and medium haul. And I think you're thinking of another blog we put out that alluded to that. Could we get hydrogen servicing a majority of short and medium haul by 2035, which would be about a third of passenger aviation demand? So in terms of bringing hydrogen-powered aircraft to market, we see three really fundamental things that need to happen. So the first is, of course, the available supply of green hydrogen needs to increase. And we also need to ensure that aviation is positioned as an off-taker for that supply. The second is we need much more significant investment in the R&D of hydrogen-powered aircraft. And the third, which is a piece that I think is sort of less exciting and sometimes overlooked, but it's the infrastructure question. How are we going to be getting hydrogen to airports? And once there, how is it refueling the aircraft? And I think those three things have to be underpinned by an actual credible push by the sector to net zero targets. And until we actually have sustained momentum away from business as usual fossil powered aircraft, it's going to be very difficult to get those investments we need to get hydrogen powered aviation off the ground.
I find that a bit confusing. How do you get aviation off jet powered or current technology aircraft while building up hydrogen? Because there are 29,000 aircraft in the air today. There will be 45,000 in 2050, most of them powered by conventional jet engines. So you need SAF. And you have to build up SAF supply. How do you do that simultaneously with hydrogen?
Yeah. So, I think this is where there are actually some great synergies that we could unlock. And I think this is where the role of e-fuels will become really important. So we know that e-fuels are probably going to reach commercialization before hydrogen-powered aircraft. And that will mean that they will be sending a signal that the aviation sector is going to be a key off-taker for hydrogen. And again, we need to do that because lots of other sectors are going to be looking for this limited green molecule. So if you're signaling through e-fuels that you're going to off-take hydrogen, you then are creating the space so that in the future, when hydrogen-powered planes come online, there actually will be available supply for those aircraft. So I think they are mutually reinforcing in this instance.
Two things around hydrogen that I still want to dig in a bit further. One is hydrogen is not a drop-in fuel. You need to store it in liquid form in minus 200 degrees Celsius. We are Canadian, so I'll stick to Celsius. We need to transport it and store it in very, very careful manners. I last heard that to power all the flights at Heathrow with hydrogen, they will need to build a storage container system the size of Terminal 5. And that's not going to be done. There's no land, right? So there are all of these ecosystem challenges that come in. And just for perspective, when the Airbus A380 came on, all they needed was a wider taxiway. and a couple of additional aero bridges. And that in itself was a huge challenge. Here we're talking about an entire ecosystem on two ends. If there's a hydrogen plane taking off, it needs to land and refuel on the other side as well. Do you think we can get there?
So I think this is where some of the work that we do at ClimateWorks to collaborate with the teams that cover other sectors becomes really important. As I alluded to, we need to signal that aviation is going to be a key off-taker for hydrogen. But we also need to think about, are there ways that, as our colleagues on shipping look to scale green hydrogen for their ships, we could actually sort of work together with them to support aviation offtake. So a question that we're starting to look into at the moment is, what would happen if, rather than siting the hydrogen storage at, say, the airport, you site it at a nearby port, which have also significant land available to them? What would that look like? What would those infrastructure needs be? So again, I think if you're just looking at this from the silo of aviation, it can become a much more challenging problem. But I think we really need to think beyond aviation and think about how we might be interacting with some of those other sectors as well. And I will also plug colleagues of mine on the Global Intelligence team just released Unlocking the Potential of Green Hydrogen, which really explores these barriers and opportunities for green hydrogen scale in depth. And it, of course, goes beyond just aviation and looks across sectors.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I will be sure to check it out, and we can include it in the show notes as well. Let's talk a little about something you've been skeptical about, which is boom and supersonic. Can you tell us why supersonic aircraft running on 100% sustainable aviation fuel might not be where boom thinks it might be in the future?
So I will speak in general terms about supersonics. This is not specifically directed at boom. So when we look, I think if we're thinking about this from the SAF perspective, and I think, the question you're getting at here is, could supersonic aircraft drive demand for SAF? Am I correct? Yes, I see you nodding. Okay. So, we consistently hear that airlines are really struggling to buy SAF in the quantities they need and at the speed they want to. So this makes it pretty clear to me that the limiting factor in the SAF market is really not demand, it's supply. And so if that's the case, it just seems incomprehensible to me that we would then introduce supersonic planes that burn 4 to 9 times more fuel per seat kilometer to compete for that very limited supply against supersonics.
While still sticking to the same topic on things that may actually drive the demand for fossil fuels, where do you see the role of carbon capture and storage coming in?
Yeah, so we actually think that there is an opportunity for the aviation sector to become a key off-taker for carbon removal when in instances either where there are residual emissions that can't be mitigated in sector, or of course, as part of the e-fuels production pathway, if you're doing direct air capture to produce those fuels. And we're really excited about that possibility because we see it as a way to scale carbon dioxide removal without actually relying on the oil and gas sector to do so. So that is where we see that synergy.
Do you foresee carbon capture becoming a way for airlines to get significant quantities of SAF or green hydrogen in the future?
I think it will be part of that solution set.
Okay, fair enough. What about things that can be done today? We've talked about SAF in the future, hydrogen in the future, but there are simple things like avoiding contrails that can be done today, which already form a significant part of aviation's total climate impact. I know this is an area ClimateWorks has looked into. What are some of the most promising strategies for mitigating contrail development, and how are you advancing them?
Yeah, great question. So I'll start by saying we are super excited by non-CO2 and contrail solutions as being a really near-term implementable climate mitigation opportunity. So I'm glad you brought it up. I'm always keen to talk about it. I think having listened to your podcast, you've already done some of the more technical deep dives on the solutions. So I will just very, high level run through the ones that are top of mind for us. So of course, route optimization would be the first and foremost solution that we're interested in. Second would be hydrotreatment of jet fuel, because not only of its non-CO2 benefit, but because of the public health benefits that you can get from hydrotreatment. And then, of course, slightly longer term, we're very excited to see more studies come out to show how SAF and also zero emissions planes could actually reduce contrails. And I think, I don't know if I said this at the top, but if I didn't, one of the ways our program works is by funding research and analysis to then inform policy and regulation. And when it comes to contrails, our approach has been no different. And not surprisingly, we've really focused our work in Europe because our theory of change, which proved out to be true, was that the European Commission would be a potential sort of first mover on non-CO2 impacts, as we've now seen.
What do you say to airlines who are sitting on the fence saying, "Oh, the scientists need to get the science right on contrails before we do something"? What if it leads to fuel burn increase and those concerns? Mm-hmm. How do we address those?
Yeah, I think this is where I have to lament a little bit of a missed opportunity. As you'll know, the European Commission introduced their monitoring, reporting, and verification regulation, which would have which will still lead to new insights about contrails and their formation. And as you, I'm sure, are well aware, there was a lot of pushback from industry on this regulation, in particular the US airlines. And so the Commission has now amended that regulation so it doesn't apply until 2027 onward. And I would say, this is the missed opportunity. If there is so much uncertainty, if we want to understand better, we should absolutely be doing exactly that: monitor, report, and verify. And particularly on those transatlantic routes, which we do, the scientific consensus seems to be are contrail hotspots. So that's sort of my lament. And then I would just say, I would love to challenge industry and just say, look, this is a really exciting near-term opportunity. The science is increasingly coming down on the side that, contrails do have a net warming effect. Let's get moving on this and let's have that really dramatic and positive climate impact. That's possible here.
Fair enough. The interesting thing is I sometimes wonder why airlines or the industry needs to be forced to do things. Yes, there are certain airlines that do things voluntarily, like DHL is buying a lot of SAF voluntarily. They're not mandated to buy as much SAF, or the fact that Delta Airlines is investing in contrail studies and trials. They're not required to. This is just a wish. I wish that more airlines, are proactive in doing things that will have a benefit for the greater good in this case. Mm-hmm. One of the things I saw you recently do was you've called the ICAO's 2015 net zero goal a major milestone, but emphasized that implementation is key. Strategy versus implementation, goals versus implementation. What do you think we need to do as an industry to get there?
So I think you've queued me up well for my answer, because my answer on this one is that we actually need civil society, not industry, to really ultimately drive the achievement of this goal. And this is where I think philanthropy has a really important role to play by providing the investments and the support for civil society to establish and advance a comprehensive vision for net zero aviation that actually puts the sector on a credible pathway to net zero. And I think to date, we've seen a lot of interest and momentum from industry on SAF. That is only one piece of the puzzle. So we need to really see a vision for aviation advanced by civil society that covers green fuels, that covers clean planes, that covers contrail mitigation, that has those hard discussions about curbing excessive flying, and that considers the role for carbon removals as well. And of course, this is going to need, a whole suite of policy, regulatory, and voluntary action. It will have to be geographically specific. And, I think it can sound daunting, but I think it's also a really exciting opportunity, both for the sector and then just more broadly for people on the planet. So that's sort of my call to action for philanthropy more broadly.
Well done, well done. In still building on this, what do you think can be the strongest role philanthropists can play in making aviation sustainable?
Um, so again, I think something that we've learned through, the history of ClimateWorks and through other successful programs that have really moved the needle, philanthropic dollars do not compete with government dollars, with industry dollars. But what we can do really effectively is seed the research and analysis, create the public discourse needed to then advance the policy, the regulation, the investments that are really needed to drive decarbonization. So again, I think our role here is to really set out that comprehensive vision that will sort of set the path for us to take for the sector.
Fair enough. As an organization, you have highlighted the need for aviation to consider equity impact. We spoke a little about the demand for hydrogen or green hydrogen coming from other sectors. In fact, you in your own doling out of grants, I believe, in the transportation sector, you've given out 58.5 million, out of which road transportation has got 48 million. Aviation has got 1/10 of that, 4 million. How do we ensure equity? And in this case, why is road so much more than aviation?
You'll have to ask my road transport colleagues that. How do we ensure equity? I think, can I ask a question back and say, what
Sure.
are you considering here? When you're thinking of equity, what do you mean by considering?
I mean equity both in terms of equity versus other sectors like marine, road, and also global equity. We see a lot of the grants going in general, let's say breakthrough energy, to technology firms in Europe or US. But yet, and also a lot of the SAF plants are coming up in North America or Europe. Yet the biggest travel growth markets are the likes of Turkey, India, Indonesia, Philippines. Not much is happening there, yet the growth is happening there. So how do you balance it all out?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So, I will admit from the ClimateWorks end of things and our aviation strategy, absolutely, to date, we've primarily focused our work to either be at ICAO in the US or in Europe. And that was really a function of where were the policy developments happening. So that's where we went. And then I do just want to add, in terms of the equity piece, I do think it's important to remember that historically, it's been the US, it's been Europe that have flown the most and have created the most emissions from this. So we do think that they also need to be the ones that are leading and paying that green premium for the new technologies that we need, and also reconsidering their growth strategies and their projected growth to make sure that there's room for other sectors to enjoy the privilege of travel, and also so that they have access to those new decarbonized technologies and can build their sectors in a way that is future-proof and climate-proof.
Fair enough. Thank you. Good answer there. Still looking at intermodality and other sectors, high-speed rail. How do you see high-speed rail playing a role in intermodality and reducing aviation's emissions?
Yeah. I mean, again, this is something that's clearly very geographically dependent. I think it certainly goes back to some of my earlier comments on demand, which is that we really look to change demand for aviation where alternatives are available. High-speed rail is absolutely a key complement to any demand reduction strategy. Will not surprise you to know that we work a lot in Europe on our demand and behavioral change strategies. I think there's some interesting work to be done in areas like China that have well-established high-speed rail. How do we ensure that that continues to receive investment? But it, of course, is something that becomes geographically specific. And as a Canadian that has no high-speed rail, I would love to see high-speed rail in my country. And I know my American colleagues feel similarly.
Hey, we have the Rocky Mountaineer. It may not be high speed, but it's beautiful. It's pretty.
Exactly. Makes up for it with its glass ceiling.
Exactly. We have to break that glass ceiling with speed. High speed rail. We often talk about places like Europe or Japan, or even the Boston to Washington corridor in the US, a SELA. But can it be applied to high growth markets like developing countries? Even, I wouldn't even say developing countries. I believe one of the new routes I just saw started was between Singapore and Malacca, which is a 137-mile route. It's a place. It's a route that is not big on business. It's a leisure route. There's going to be an Embraer aircraft E2 flying there, and emissions are way higher than car or bus, which is like a 3-hour drive, max 4 hour if you take multiple stops. But yet, the high-speed rail between Malaysia and Singapore has been scrapped by both the governments. Do you think in the future there'll be pressure on governments in other parts of the world to reinstate high-speed rail projects?
I mean, this goes back to my initial point, which is we're just starting to scope our strategies in those regions. So, certainly my hope would be that we expand alternatives to air travel, but again, it's going to be geographically specific, and I don't have the information yet to comment specifically on those geographies.
Fair enough. I'm pushing this I'm pushing this a bit further. Do you also look at maritime personally, or is that ClimateWorks colleagues who are doing it?
Yeah, so you would have to invite my colleagues Jason, Prashant, and Grace on, and you could do a crossover episode maybe. Sector.
Yeah, we've never done maritime. We've had some rather funky sectors, but not maritime yet.
I think it could be fun.
Overall, when you're deciding to give a grant, what are you looking at? Are you looking at short-term impact, long-term impact? If you are to sum up all of your work at ClimateWorks, what do you think is the big highlight, and how are you pushing the frontier forward?
Oh, those are tough questions. I think our grants, they vary depending on what is the goal that they're contributing to. So sometimes we'll have a rapid response grant if, all of a sudden a policy comes online that we weren't expecting, or something changes, so there's a new direction, and we'll look for a grantee that can respond quickly to that. In other cases, we are looking to, as I just mentioned, scope work in new regions. So that sort of grant is going to be patient. It's going to be a little bit longer timescales. It's going to create that space for that deep research and analysis to then inform those outcomes we're pushing for. So I would say our grants vary depending on what the strategic pillar is that we're trying to support. I would say, there's a whole range of outcomes and developments that I could point to, but I think overall, I've only been in this job 2 years. So the thing that I think has been most rewarding for me is to really see the community both of grantees grow. So just the number of organizations that previously weren't working on aviation that now are prioritizing this is really exciting. And then same for philanthropic organizations that are now taking an interest and really understanding that this is a challenge that we need to start dedicating time and resources to, and being able to be a bit of a connector and a convener for those groups has been exciting. So I feel like I have a lot more company now than when I started in this position 2 years ago, which is great.
Fantastic. Thank you for the inspiring work, Anna, that you're doing in pushing sustainable aviation forward. The final part of this interview, and since you're an avid listener of the podcast, you know what's coming. It's a rapid fire round. So we get to know you a bit more personally.
So excited.
Yes. What's your favorite airline?
Oh, favorite airline. I'm going to punt on this and say not an airline, but I'm very excited that Spain now has a whole bunch of new low-cost, high-speed rail carriers, and it's increased the amount of service on high-speed routes, and then it has also really decreased the price. And we've seen a very direct link to more people taking the train in Spain, which is exciting.
Wow. Okay. Nice curveball there. Favorite airport?
Favorite airport?
Yeah.
I don't have one.
Okay. All right. How about your favorite book?
Favorite book? I'm going to go author, and I'm going to say Ann Patchett.
Okay. Good one. Favorite movie?
I'm going to go TV show, and I won't admit the sort of TV I watch on a regular basis because that would be embarrassing. And I will say my favorite show in recent years was The Last of Us.
Okay, you've dosed me on 4 out of 4 questions without direct answers. This is interesting. What do you do in your free time, Anna?
This one I can do. I walk my dog, I box, and I'm very, very tentatively learning how to surf.
You box. Fantastic. Okay, I have to stay at least 6 feet away from you when we
I'm
meet.
glad this is on Zoom. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. This is virtual. You already said you want to learn surfing, so we know that one. What is the best advice you've received?
So this was from my aunt, and I don't know if she got this from someone else. I've never Googled it because it came from her. But I was really struggling with a decision and, going through the what ifs and, maybe this, that, future. She just goes, you know what? You make your decision with the best information you have at the time. And that's all you can do right now. And that's really
Absolutely
helped me then. It's helped me since then. So shout out to my aunt.
By the way, it sounds very Canadian because I've heard this before as well.
Have you? Okay, there you go.
Myself,
so it wasn't from
yes.
her.
No, it is. I think it just goes between the families. You make the best decision based on the information you have, and then you'll stick by it. Finally, if we are speaking 1 year from now and we are popping champagne, what are we celebrating?
We're celebrating significant progress on non-CO2.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Anna. Really appreciated your time and all the best.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simplifying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simplifying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Meera Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimen is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.